Welcome to this new podcast series titled Talking Book Publishing with Steve and Tara. Hello, I'm Tara Brabazon.
And I'm Steve Bradley.
And welcome to this, our fourth podcast in our series on the book, and particularly the writing of books for academics. And you knew we had to get here. The fourth podcast is titled The Perils of Publishers. Oh yeah. Now, we've talked in some earlier podcasts about some fantastic editors, some fantastic publishers that have actually changed our lives, transformed people's lives, taken a risk financially and professionally and paid off, for which we are incredibly grateful. And that's the really buoyant, optimistic part of this story. But let's get negative and let's really talk about how some publishers have also ruined our lives as well. Almost all writers, if you've been around long enough, have absolute horror stories from publishers. Steve, what are some of the most dreadful things that publishers have ever done to you? And this could be a long or a short answer.
I mentioned in one of our earlier conversations about my first book, which was published by Pluto Press, and even though they were great, the economics of publishing, which I think is always there in the background, especially if you're doing something a bit innovative and a bit radical, they were always a problem. And in fact, you know, that publisher went bust 3 times before my book, written in 1984, was actually published in 1987. And it wasn't the commissioning editor or anything like that there was a problem. It was actually the background economics of publishing in the mid-1980s in the UK. And I think that you're finding that more and more, that if you're going to publish a book, you know, you don't know whether some of, particularly smaller publishers, are going to last.
Wow.
And that's certainly always a problem. I think part of the problem I've experienced is that I've literally hundreds of rejections of proposals, which actually were pretty good. Yep. They might have needed a bit of tweaking, but you know, I simply do not understand why those things got rejected. I can see why some not so good proposals that I sent in got rejected, but there were lots that were really good, and I actually gave up on a lot of those simply because I got sick to death of writing to publishers who'd obviously just binned the proposal.
Or can I intervene for a second? There's a horrible story, and we won't mention the publisher, where you'd put in a fantastic proposal on a particular topic and they'd knocked you back, and somebody came out with the identical book and proposal and topic within a year.
Yeah, that certainly happened. And I've had a few of those. And I think that's again, par for the course.
Same publisher, by the way. Same publisher, same editor.
Yeah, absolutely. And the par for the course thing is a problem that you just get used to the problems. And I think you just have to harden yourself particularly as a young writer, or particularly as a young academic, and you need to get as much support and general collective presence. Really, you know, you need to go to people and say, "Look, this is what's happened to me," and you'll get people saying, "That's what happened to me." And I just think, particularly now, you just have to really harden yourself and keep going. Keep going is my advice, basically. It was my advice to myself, and I'm glad I did. Otherwise, I would have given up and written nothing.
It is very important. The rejections will be catastrophic, and also the rejections will be actually nasty. I think that's the thing, is the level, because again, the personal investment is so high, the emotional investment is high, the publishers know that, and some of the pretty rancid stuff that comes back is disgusting.
Absolutely appalling.
Is disgusting. But I'll offer to our listeners some advice you gave me very early on. Particularly because my first 3 books were with the same publisher, and I've worked with a lot of threes, a lot of triplets actually with publishers. And you said to me, when you find a good publisher, meaning an editor in a publishing organisation, then work with them and stay with them as long as you can, because they leave. Yeah. So do you want to talk a little bit about the cycle of really great editors?
Yeah, I think one of the things is that I've worked with different kinds of publishers, and my experience would say university presses, I can think of one particular good example where I had a great editor over many years, Sarah Edwards, at a university
Wonderful
press, and I was lucky because she continued in that job for a long time. She was absolutely excellent, and she didn't leave for a long time. She moved within the organisation to something else, but you don't always get that with other publishers. People move on so quickly that actually they commission your book and they've gone within a couple of weeks.
I was just going to, if I can name check the wonderful Caroline Wintersquill as well at Ashgate,
Yes.
who really was transformative
Yes,
for me. 3-4
absolutely.
books, and then of course she moved on.
Absolutely.
So your cliche, if you like, make hay while the sun shines is important. If you've had a good relationship with a publisher and an editor, almost stay with them because those editors will leave.
Yeah, I think that's good advice.
Yeah, I just, because they're so rare, the really good people, work that seam as long as you can. But just to give you one horror story, and of course Steve knows this, exactly who did this. Again, I won't name the publisher, but I had that horrible experience, Steve, where one of the major international publishers on the planet, if you remember, I had a book accepted at a smaller publisher, gone through all refereeing, accepted, and literally the contract was arriving the next day. That smaller publisher was bought by the bigger publisher, who said that they didn't know who I was, didn't want to publish that book, but sort of was in this sort of legal quagmire of the previous publisher. And I put the foot on the pedal a little bit and said, look, you know, statements were made here are the emails, and made it a little bit legally complicated for them. And so they, if you remember, they went through refereeing again to try and find somebody who would knock the book back and therefore wouldn't publish it. And by the end of this single book, it had gone through 8 referees because they'd continued to try and find a referee that didn't like it. And thankfully, they didn't find a referee that didn't like it. It took literally 2 years to come out from a book that was actually written and accepted. But that's a great example of a publisher not playing fair, behaving really disgracefully, but behaving like that because they can.
Yeah, very much so. And I think it is often a dirty business, and you can be asked to pay to publish.
We've had one of those, of course.
Both in book publishing and in refereed articles.
Should I quickly tell that story?
I think it's a good...
I'll quickly tell that story.
It's a good morality tale.
It's a good morality tale. Again, I won't mention the publisher. We're doing well on this, guys. But we actually had a situation where a book was completely written. It was an edited collection for a university press. Book completely written, many great contributors, often younger postgraduates, meant everything to them. Their first publication, huge. So the book was completed. The contract, again, was prepared and ready to sign. The book had been submitted. And the editor, on a late Friday afternoon, one would assume after some nice little Chardonnay drinkies at lunchtime, stated that, oh, well, yes, the book has been accepted and gone through refereeing and so forth, but we're now going to require $2,000 for you to publish this book. And we were absolutely shattered. I mean, you'd never come across anything like that.
No, it's the worst I've seen.
I had not. It was like, it came out of nowhere, and you thought, is this now vanity publishing? Because, it had gone through refereeing, it had all been signed up and sealed. I'd seen the editors, all our contributors had given their blood, sweat and tears to produce the book. So we felt really, chained up about what we could actually do. And they said, do you remember at the time, they said, oh, look, just ask your university to pay it. Just ask your university to pay. So it was just clearly a revenue-raising function. We managed to get them down to...
It was blackmail.
It was blackmail, thank you. We managed to get them down to $1,000 and paid it and got the book through, but I would never have any dealings with them ever again. I've never refereed for them. I would never deal with them again, and anybody I would ask who asked me about publishers, I'd say stay away from them.
But you have more normalisation of that sort of thing by, in some cases... Jill's asking you to pay to get published. That's become a much more globally accepted thing. And I think, the as I said before, the economics of the thing, the economic background to a lot of problems in publishing is still as grave as ever. Not just the 1980s that I talked about before.
Yeah. Well, this was actually in the early 2000s.
It was.
That story happened to me. So really catastrophic. So when bad things happen to you, don't think you're on your own and isolated, because actually bad things happen to most of us, I think. Next question, Steve. You and I are very different on this. I almost always write a completed book, then write a proposal, then submit it to a publisher. That's how I do things in all cases except one of my books. I've written the book completely, written a proposal, submitted both. You tend to write proposals first, send that to a publisher, and then, depending on what happens, write the book. So why do you do that? Why do you go through that process?
Yes, it's a good contrast, isn't it? And I think you can do it either way. But I was actually told when I started, as a young academic, that's what you did. So I followed the advice I was given. And I probably have done that all the time. Yeah.
Upon being married to me, have you pondered and reflected on those decisions that you've made?
Sometimes, but I haven't necessarily changed.
And you're picking up a lot about our marriage. So basically the bottom line of that question, guys, is both systems do actually work.
Absolutely.
I have never written a book that I haven't got published. So don't think, oh no, I've got like drawers filled with manuscripts that have never been published. Every single manuscript that I have written has been published. So do think about that. Maybe, can I just do a feminist statement here? Because I was unknown in Australia, I always thought, I think probably, that if I just wrote the proposal, they didn't know who I was. Yeah. So they wouldn't actually see the quality of the work. Whereas I suppose because I wrote the book, I backed myself and said, well, you think I can't do it, or here's the bloody book. Yeah,
that's a really good point. And I think it is difficult to get through the gatekeeping because people see your name, and the names often get through. That's part of the problem of publishing.
And I think I've probably found as my career's gone on, it's got easier. I do think that. I think that the name, ironically, it does have that cascading effect, I think. But as a woman, everything's wrong. I was from West Australia, I was a woman, I was in the humanities, it was all really pretty. I was known best as a really good teacher too. That was my other problem. And a speaker. So I had all those problems. And so the only way I could prove that I could write a book was to write one. And so I think that's maybe where I've ended up on that treadmill. And the time when I did write a proposal, when I was asked to write a proposal first with a, again, very major international publisher, that was a pretty terrible experience actually. So I will continue to use my model. And of course that terrible experience leads to my next question, which is about textbooks. Now, you and I rarely write textbooks. My dreadful experience was about a textbook, dreadful experience. What would you like to say to guys and gals thinking, do I write a scholarly monograph or do I write a textbook?
Well, my point about never making money out of books, or rarely making money out of books, can be contradicted by, the particular textbook that is written, and that does make money for people.
Yep.
A particular type of textbook. I've tried to get textbooks published, and I never got them published, funnily enough. So I kind of stopped trying to write them.
Wow.
Over the years, I've probably used them less in my teaching.
Yeah. And of course, Steve is in law, so obviously law textbooks. In the humanities, we've probably not used them as much. But
I started in law and criminology, and I think textbooks were pretty important, certainly when I first started teaching. Less important now.
Yeah.
I think monographs are more important, actually.
Yeah.
Than they were.
The thing to maybe think about is that the advice I'd offer people is I've written one textbook. I was asked to write it, wrote the proposal first, then wrote the book. The book itself took me about 3 years to write. I was writing other stuff at the same time, and it was the worst experience of my life. It was dreadful. I found the publishing really poor. I just found it very, very difficult to write for a very basic audience. And in fact, they were gearing it for I think a first-year market. And when I submitted it, they went, oh, it's a fantastic book, but it's probably a third-year book. So, it was just a dreadful, dreadful experience. So you almost have a sensation that you're not free. My feeling as someone who wrote a textbook is that you just think you're not writing for yourself. You're not writing in a way that has, and I'll be honest here, integrity. You had a bit of a sense that you were pimping yourself for that particular audience. And I can't really see myself ever doing that again, to be honest with you. Life's too short and books are too precious, I think. Any other comment about that, Steve?
Yeah, I think also what I would say is that idea of the monograph replacing textbooks in many disciplines is interesting in general because you've got this. I did talk about the idea of an anti-intellectual culture globally before, but I also think there is its opposite, where there is a huge demand, particularly amongst young students all over the world now, for really hard, really difficult monograph work. You think of what I call this kind of era theoretical times, because theorists are globally consumed in a way that disciplines weren't before. So if you think of people like Slavoj Žižek or Alain Badiou, people like that, who are real global superstars in many ways, and people can't get enough of their books. What they want are really difficult monographs that are really challenging them in this anti-intellectual times. They don't want a textbook by these people because the disciplines themselves have been smashed by their work. So it's quite an interesting time to be living in the sense that monographs are really coming back in many ways.
They are, and there's also a credibility. We haven't really gone to the cred variable yet, but if you have written the scholarly monographs, you have, put the hard yards in, worked hard and produced them, it has an incredible credibility with colleagues, with layers of government, with policymakers and students. And I just want to use a wonderful example of a wonderful student you and I both had. He was a fourth year, I think, in legal studies at UOIT. And he was a lovely lad, and I taught him, he was a bright boy, you taught him. It was weird that your husband and wife team taught him in different fields. I had him in comm, and you had him in legal studies. Yeah. And I remember he said to us both in the corridor, he'd read our works, he'd read our books, and he was going, for the first time I'm really being taught by the first team rather than the rookies. Yeah. And I thought that was a really powerful statement from that young man.
Yeah, and he loved the books we'd written.
Yeah, and this was real. So these people have actually put the hard yards in, and I respect the work that they've done. So that's a symbolic functionality, I think, of a book as well.
Yeah, and it is part of the counter tendency of this, against anti-intellectual culture. And I think we shouldn't write that off. And that means there is a huge global audience for the monograph.
And therefore, let's talk about the final question in this bit, the peril of publishers, money. Right. And there's silence from the Northern Englishman. What's that? Look, surprising things happen. Look, the contracts that often you have to sign to get through a scholarly monograph will chill your soul. You get 2, 3, 4, 5, 8% of the cover price. And what's the cover price when the expenses are taken out? On we go. So it is an incredibly inapt science. Sometimes you get desperate with books and you have to really accept an offer that is just horrifying. But, there are some surprises, monetary surprises as well. What's been your, and I won't say bestseller because these can be different. What's your most financially rewarding book, do you think?
Probably a trade book like Repetitive Beat Generation, which had a lot of academic work that went into it, but it was basically published by Canongate in its Rebel Inc. form as a trade book. Yeah. And it had an intellectual and political background, but basically it was a trade book. And I'm really proud of that. I think it's still a great book, and particularly because it was writing about working class novels, effectively, not just about drugs and rave culture. It was about the working class culture producing particular sort of novel forms, and I'm really proud of that book. And that probably did make me some money, and probably I did better with that than others.
I think that's important, and of course part of that is working that trade audience. Part of it is also being in the right place at the right time. Yeah. But when I also am talking about surprises, one of the great surprises, Steve, I had was Playing on the Periphery. Yeah. That was this hardback book. It was buried in Routledge's list. They said, oh, look, here's a book on Australia, New Zealand, colonial, post-colonial sport, who gives a damn? And so they buried it in a hardback. And unbelievably, publishers all over the world, libraries and librarians, respect to my library colleagues, librarians all over the world started to go, oh, look, this is a great book, we'll buy it for our collection. Yeah. And like thousands of libraries through South Africa, through many of the African nations, through Europe, through Asia, and Australia, New Zealand bought this book. Yeah. And I remember we opened the cheque the first time thinking, oh, look, we'll get 4 tubs of yogurt and a banana here. And I was like absolutely stunned, and that's probably the biggest check we've ever received from a hardback that just happened to have actually had quite a big scholarly seam. That, and again, you think trade, but also if you can get into an emerging area of, in that case, post-colonial sport, where that was really the first book in that area, all the libraries went, well, we've got a book that fills a gap.
Yeah.
So there are surprises there.
And that fitted a particular series, that Sport in the Global Society series that Routledge did.
Yes.
I think that's interesting too. The idea of fitting at a particular time into a particular series is important.
Because, again, if you want the library market, the series matters. Because what a lot of librarians do is they pre-order the series. So if they think they can actually cover an area in their collection through the series, so pre-orders become great.
Yeah.
So that matters as well. So think about textbooks, think about the deals that sometimes you have to make, but also think about your audiences. And every now and again, books do surprise you. Thank you for listening to this podcast series on talking book publishing with Steve and Tara. For further information, please feel free to contact us at Charles Sturt University.